Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Ian said, this is the third session that we've done. What I've hoped to convey in the previous sessions as well as the one today is that we need to sometimes resort to first principles with coming to address risk management needs. And one of the themes that will sort of come through quite strongly today is a lot of the attention that's being given to ESG in its broader ambit, and hopefully the experience that I've seen over the years and things that I've heard from speaking to people, I'll be able to share some of those learnings. Encourage people to ask questions. We may only get to them at the end of the presentation, but hopefully this will sort of prompt some thinking. I've intentionally made it slightly controversial, and I think it's necessary for us to sort of be the best practitioners we can possibly be. So let me kick things off. So the theme today is that there is risk and the risk trends that we follow. And what I'd like to just ensure is that everyone follows that logic through and doesn't take it as any criticism, but I think it's really useful to understand in the work we do. So if we take these two individuals, so Andy Grove and Steve Ballmer are renowned CEOs from the IT industry. You would think that they know what they're talking about in tech, but if we look at two of their comments from years gone by, you can see that they were significantly off the mark. And I think that it's worth noting that we may not be tech giants working in the tech industry. We're just individuals in various industries, but as risk practitioners, we often expected to have a broad understanding of what's happening out there. What do our boards, what do our frontline operators need to understand? And so the question comes to mind is, where do we get some of these insights? And the obvious one is obviously the range of reports that come out every year. I mean, I think many of you on this call today would have attended the World Economic Forum annual report launches that RIMS hosts. I think we all go there in anticipation of finding out the latest, greatest information, and we get some hugely valuable insights, and you know, we learn a lot from what we do. And their work is extensively researched, but what I'd like to stress is that we need to check our bias, and we need to remember that risk is contextual. And hopefully through today's conversation, you'll get a sense of what I'm angling at. So what do I mean by bias? So I'll very briefly talk to that. I mean, obviously, a lot of us have been through various types of training, would have seen it in its various guises, but I wanted to just sort of give a sense of what it means for us as risk practitioners, show where those risky trends crop up, and then what we might think about, how do we deal with it? How do we mitigate those risks? So firstly, what is bias? And I mean, really, there'll probably be many definitions, but the one that is really most pertinent is it's where our beliefs collide with facts and evidence. And what does that mean? Well, if we take someone like Nick Kristof, now Nick is a renowned journalist. He presents his content all over the world. He's won Pulitzer Prizes, but I think what's quite interesting is he doesn't necessarily say that we're just after true or good information, but we're looking for ones that confirms our prejudices. And what he means by that is, if we have our beliefs and we look at the overlap with facts and evidence, it's that sort of sweet spot in the middle that we will believe and use in what we do. And that even means the work we do as risk practitioners. But there's a portion that we might choose to ignore just because it doesn't necessarily resonate with what we're wanting to do, what we're hearing in the corridors, what our executives and what our board members are expecting. But it's worthwhile noting that these things become more prevalent. And I think I've seen it in many of the workspaces that I speak to at the moment. So if you think that you don't have an issue with a bias, I'd like you to read the sentence. You can see that it's a strong sort of anti-immigration statement. It's based in the United States, and I bet many of you would be inclined to think that it came from this person or one of his colleagues or a Republican, but you'd be wrong. The person who actually said this was Barack Obama, and this was in 2006. And I think what it goes to show is, depending on the context we find ourselves in, and depending what the rhetoric is that we see in social media, in the newspapers, we are very inclined to hear things and pass judgment. And when they don't match that zone of overlap between, what we believe in and what the evidence shows, there's a bit of dissidence. And I think it's critical for us to understand that with a lot of the risks that our organization faces, because risk is complex, risk is multifaceted, risk is not something that is simply tackled and neatly stowed away. So I'm hoping that today's conversation sort of picks up on some of those themes. So where do these risky trends crop up? And I think it's fair to say that it's in all aspects of risk management. And what I mean by that is it's using the risk process. It crops up in every element of the risk process. So it hampers and impacts us being able to manage risk in the right way. And probably more importantly, it crops up in the content. So the actual risks that we're looking at. So we may not look at the right risks. And so using this simple risk management process, I thought I'd sort of articulate some of those thoughts. So one of the risky trends is that we have to address or cater for other agendas. And I purposely sort of bookended the risk management process to highlight some of those things. And this might be quite a controversial statement, but what I wanted to say is that there are other tails wagging the risk dog. And what I mean by that is if we look at governance, risk and compliance, or environmental social governance, which is ESG, the requirements that come out of those other aspects can be quite compromising of how we approach risk. They can be quite burdensome, and I'll give an example of that. And we may not be fully appreciative of how antagonistic they can be, and that can create a lot of tension in the organizations in which we work. So first of all, if I take this logic of the GRC relationship, risk really is often about should we do this? There looks like there's quite a bit to be gained from it. And to some extent, the two elements that sort of constrain it or weigh it down are the compliance side. Can we actually do this? And the governance side is the, would we be doing this? That sort of ethical lens. And you might think this is sort of hypothetical, but a number of years ago, I worked with one of the banks in New Zealand, and I was asked this from a very senior risk person. They said, we are seeing our competitors pursuing opportunities that are slightly risky, but are hugely beneficial, but are constraining ourselves due to our concern for governance and compliance requirements. And I think it's really important to appreciate, while we articulate GRC as being this thing that is very cohesive, if you think about risk in its truest sense in terms of, chasing opportunity and trying to create value, we need to appreciate how these other elements can interface with it. And if we take this individual, and I don't put him up here because I'm South African, it's just I've recently read his biography and I can highly recommend it. The things he's done are quite amazing, but what really struck me is in his pursuit of risk and the things that he's done, one of his key elements was to cut away any requirement that he thought was superfluous. And quite often those were compliance or governance requirements. So much so that if you look at all the litigation and all the claims against him, they range from how he's dealt with his workers, and obviously a lot of that makes the press when he bought out Twitter. During COVID, he challenged the government and was able to keep his Tesla operation open while the rest of us were locked down. There's just so much of what he's done that has contributed to the bottom line that many of us wouldn't entertain because of these governance and compliance constraints. So very often I meet with people, and it's not unusual for us to be in organizations where we have to look after both risk and compliance. And we do tackle those tensions on a regular basis. But, when there are very key strategic risk decisions being made, they're often made within the strategic areas or within financing, and maybe we're excluding from those conversations altogether, and the value we could add may not be fully realized. So it's useful to understand those tensions and not necessarily get too favorable of one over the other. When we look at ESG, I've worked in the broader sort of ESG, sustainability, environmental field almost my whole career in various ways and shapes and forms. And quite interesting enough, when I came to New Zealand several years ago, 7 years ago, I thought that one of the areas I could really pitch for was ESG and how it is critical to what we do in business. And I will tell you, not only colleagues, but many clients were not interested. And we fast forward to today, and everybody is an ESG expert, and positions are being advertised for ESG. And I think what's very evident is when we are committing to our climate risk disclosures, which is sort of front and center of everyone's minds, it's, you know, you can realize very quickly the risk requirements expected to underpin those climate disclosures are extremely mature in nature. I've worked in many organizations where the risk function is, you know, almost an individual or not even someone in the risk in their title, as opposed to what you might have in the financial services where we have very devoted teams across all three lines. And I can tell you right now that even at the top end of town, all the risk requirements that you would need to truly underpin what is being required for climate disclosure and managing ESG are not necessarily in place. So what I'm trying to demonstrate is that ESG has come along, and we're probably very grateful for it because it's almost a Trojan horse for risk and compliance to really get a more prominent position in the business. But it does create a whole lot of burden. We scramble around trying to pull together content for reporting and not necessarily managing the risks. Obviously, reputational risk comes into it, and if we don't do it, we'd be at fault, or so would compliance risk. But I think we don't fully appreciate how extreme these ESG requirements are. And I'll give you another example of this later on, but one of the things we also find out is we get told this is the risk. Content that circulates in our, as I say, in our social media pages, colleagues we speak to will push an agenda, and we don't always have a complete picture. So when we look at something like ESG, we think of, or we see people thinking of ESG as the risk, a risk. But when you unpack it into its various elements, not only does it cover almost every area of the business, it's not some little sustainability mandate. It touches on everything. And, if you go back 10, 20 years in many of the dirty industries, the sort of the oil, gas, the mining, they were having to tackle this all the time, because while you need labor to perform, to mine a resource cheaply, there's obviously going to be these tensions, and you quite often see that cropping up around, do you know where your cell phones come from, and are you appreciative of the lithium in your EV? So I think this is a real challenge that's going to become more prevalent, and I think to some extent we're already seeing some pushback in parts of the world where if you're trying to create shareholder return and you are opting just for stakeholder return, what can happen is that you get these tensions and people push back, and we've got to realize that these tensions exist and not just think, oh, there's ESG and off we go, and all it means is that we provide a report, because the report might be at the end of the pipeline, but so much more has got to come before it, and we really need to be cognizant of that. There was a piece that I came across several years ago that spoke about the three dragons of ESG, and they were hypocrisy, inconsistency, and unintended consequences. And I think we often see that we might be pushing an agenda, and obviously there's a great concern around greenwashing or green wishing, and that's not going to go away, because when you set up these rules and these requirements, be aware that these tensions might play out, and it's not going to be plain sailing. And I'll show you some other examples later. But these things are front and center of every risk practitioner, or should be, and we should be trying to grapple with them. And obviously, risk is about trade-offs, risk and reward. So this isn't necessarily going to be a black and white dichotomous decision. There's going to be shades of grey that we really have to tackle and try and get our heads around. Otherwise, we are just not being appreciative of what we're trying to manage in the business. And I think the one that really resonates with me is I have a background in having studied environmental science, and it's quite amazing how sort of that carbon tunnel vision, this intentional risk blindness comes through, where we are very focused on carbon emissions, but there's a range of other things. Unfortunately, the move to include TNFD with TCFD means that we are giving far greater appreciation to the wider scope of things. And I think that's going to really enrich the conversation in a way that's long overdue. The other thing that's quite interesting is that these intentional decisions can also be reciprocated with unintentional decisions. And this is I don't know if any of you have seen the diagram on the left. Is you get asked to watch where the basketball's being passed between people in their white shirts, and a person in a gorilla suit moves from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side of the screen. And when you asked, did you see the gorilla, most people will say there wasn't one. And when the video is played back, it's very clear that that was there. And they've done a similar exercise where they hit a gorilla in the scan of someone's lungs, and they were asking doctors to try and pick it up, and they couldn't pick it up. And when you get the slide deck and have a look at it, look at the right-hand lung towards the right-hand side, there is a clear illustration of the gorilla there, and these things were missed. And it's amazing how often, if any of you have worked as auditors or done audits or inspections, where you will go to a site and you'll do something, you'll pick up something that looks glaringly obvious to you, yet the people that are working there are none the wiser, because it's become so part and parcel of what they're doing. And I think we have that concern of not identifying it, and then if we do identify it, we may become quite defensive and then intentionally just sort of steer around it. And you know, we really need to get better at that, because at some stage something is going to crop up. One of the big coal miners in South Africa has just been issued with a case from previous workers challenging them, and for many years they knew that could potentially be a risk. And obviously they would have the lawyers in place and they would have done everything they needed to appreciate it. But at some stage, this will come home and you need to deal with it. So it's the earlier on we appreciate it, and the earlier on we do things for the right reasons with that sort of risk mindset, the better place we are to tackle some of these things. So next one along is probably more in terms of the process than it is in terms of the content. And it's this idea when we analyze risk that the risk matrix is bad. It's, you know, almost every time I go onto LinkedIn, something crops up where people are challenging the risk matrix. Now, several years ago, I did a presentation at a risk conference on the flaws of the risk matrix, or how the risk matrix is used. But I think what we need to appreciate is the risk matrix was never meant to be the one and only tool we managed all our risks by. It's a mechanism that is very good at passing a whole lot of information, getting everyone on the same page and creating conversation. I doubt, or I'd like to believe, that there isn't a single organization out there that takes that information as sacrosanct and makes all the decisions and around where they are placed in terms of the colors of the risk matrix. But it should be a precursor to the necessary assessment. So if you're looking at climate risk and you need to do scenario analysis, if you're doing financial risk modeling, you will use more sophisticated, you know, Monte Carlo analysis. All these things should come after the risk matrix as a tool for analysis. Use it in the way that it facilitates good conversation, but don't discard it just because people on LinkedIn are saying that it's a very flawed tool. And there's a lot of that at the moment. And I think, you know, don't lose something that's quite useful that can lead you to do more sophisticated analysis along the lines. And I think there are other risk tools like that. I've seen the risk appetite framework applied in very strange ways. You know, it's obviously very suited to catering for financial risk and how you can quantify and graduate it across things. But when we get into other areas of risk management, we superimpose our consequence ratings from our risk matrix onto appetite, and you know, they don't lend themselves to that in all instances. If you took something like a health and safety risk, yes, we know we don't want to be in the top right hand corner of the matrix, but if you are pursuing something where you are intentionally trying to be innovative, you may well need to be in that part of the risk matrix. And again, that may be the inappropriate tool to use, but just be mindful that the trend of you need to throw out the risk matrix might be quite short-sighted if you don't have the necessary understanding of what else you can use. If we move down to the next one in terms of evaluating risk, I think, you know, in the time that I've been, probably in the last 5 or 10 years, that the prior to AI, the first sort of port of call was, we've got the means to collect more data. Let's collect more data and let's analyze more data, because that way we'll do better things with risk management. Now, obviously, in some instances where we are afforded the opportunity to do continuous monitoring, that can be hugely valuable, and we have a richer data set that we can analyze. But I think there may be a tendency, because we receive information from the business and not necessarily get it firsthand, that a story is told to us, and that's just one story. And I'd like to use this, the information that we get out of that WEF risk report, just to demonstrate how it can differ so much. And this is the real value that I gained from that WEF report, is that if we look at 2 different age groups and we look at the risks that concern them, it's very interesting to see that while there are very strong overlaps, you look at something like the 5th most concerning risk to people in the sort of the 50 to 59 age group was cyber security, yet it didn't feature very high in the group that are younger than 30. Obviously, the way we understand the technology can mean something very different. But what we need to appreciate is when we present, these are the top 10 risks, they are the average of many of these age groups. And, you know, I remember having a lecturer at university that said, I can have an average body temperature of 27 degrees if I put my feet in the fire and my head in the freezer. And neither one of those is good for me. So be aware of these trends in the data, and also the fact that when we're looking at these risks, that there's also a time frame to it. And I think what struck me most from these 2 populations was that cost of living crisis. So for the top age group, it was the 4th one, and for the bottom age group, it was the 1st one. If we went forward in time, you can see how that had dropped to the 15th and the 18th risk respectively. And that's just part of our sort of human behavior, how we discount the future and think, oh, those kind of things will be okay. And so it's useful to appreciate the data we look at can tell a range of stories, and it's up to us to understand the devil in the detail and not have our biases compromise that. Another good example is that we can collect data and it can provide us with results that are completely poles apart. This is an infographic which shows across the world, how do people view AI? Do they think it will help them, which is the sort of the yellow part of the spectrum, or do they think it'll harm them? That's the dark pink red areas. And you can see that depending on where you are in the world, you can view this in very different ways for whatever reason. And you could easily have AI as a risk on your risk register and not be fully appreciative of how that can change in your business, particularly if you are a global entity that has operations around the world. So it's really useful to understand that when we are egged on to present risk information in a summarized form into a top 10 list, or it's very easy for us to lose this richness. And granted, we don't have the luxury of trying to tell the full story, because the minute that we try to do so, we would lose our audience. But it's useful to understand that and where we can to leverage those insights. Next one along is how we treat the risk. And obviously, what I'm alluding to here is where the cure is worse than the disease. And I'd like to talk to sort of 3 main elements. So for those of you that are old enough, you may remember the Y2K crisis in 1999, where the belief was at the time that the clock struck 12 on the 31st of December 1999 and went into the year 2000. Aeroplanes would be falling out the sky, all our spreadsheets would become null and void. And there was a huge amount of attention to try and address this. And I think one of the things that, while we might have probably curtailed realistic concerns, we were also faced with a lot of people just almost being like deer in the headlights. Many things just stopped out of fear. The cure we had for this potential risk, one that we really didn't know what would happen until that actually played out, was quite detrimental, and it created a lot of fear. And I mean, this is in an era prior to social media. So even then, you know, here it is on the Time magazine cover. That's where people's concerns were. If I use something more acute, I'll use that that example of the oil spill I spoke about in the first training presentation that I did. And the thing that was quite amazing there is one of the things that the companies wanted to do, BP had decided they were going to use a chemical to try and capture and collect the oil that was floating on the surface. And unfortunately, what it ended up doing is causing a lot of that oil to sink into the ocean and impact some of the fauna and flora, the ocean fauna and flora, to a far more significant degree if it had been left on the surface. That's not to say that it wouldn't have impacted animals and birds and the shore life itself, but it showed that we had a cure, we tried to do something with it, and it ended up creating a lot more impact than we anticipated. And I think that's a good segue to the last diagram and all the conversations that are going around at the moment in terms of the impact of lockdown during COVID. While we were trying dearly to protect people, we created potentially far worse impacts on the global economy. And so when we think about our controls in the business, when we put them in place, have we considered the kinds of risks they create? And you may think these are quite far removed from what you do, but I think when you look at the reason why things like PayPal came into existence, or why there's such a big push for using APIs and open banking and all that, it's all trying to make it more streamlined. I mean, anyone who's gone through a know your customer requirement because of concerns around anti-money laundering will know how burdensome some of those forms are and how restrictive it feels. They are valid controls, but they can be so stifling that people go, well, I'm going to look for other options. I just really can't deal with this. And the same will happen in the business. You put controls in place and people look for workarounds. So always be mindful of, if I put this control in place, what risks can come of that? I think one of the ones that's probably top of mind for a lot of us is that we had images of turtles with plastic straws sticking out their nose and what it meant for, you know, sea life. And there was this huge push to get paper straws. And, you know, the diagram on the side is showing you, yes, we might be getting paper straws, but they come in a plastic wrapper and the container we use is a plastic container. So again, that sort of that hypocrisy that we spoke about earlier. But I think what's more important is that they found that a lot of these paper straws, in fact, over 90% of them in the study that was done in Belgium, picked up that they had these forever chemicals in them, PFASs. And if you don't think that's prominent, you only need to look at the kind of concerns that insurers are needing to deal with. This PFAS concern is something that's going to crop up in the future. And if you're not sure what a forever chemical does, it can contribute to, you know, compromised immunity, cancers, etc. So these are all things we need to tackle, and they're probably not restricted to paper straws, as you well know. The next one is monitoring and review, and this is really around, again, if I have more data, I have more answers, and it really amazes me how quickly we take a whole lot of data and try to draw conclusions from that. And the one that I'd like to start off with is, if you look at these graphs, these are graphs for those of you who can't read. They were picking up the prevalence of terms such as racist, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, etc. And if you look at the graphs from around the world, and unfortunately there are a couple more which I couldn't get on the slide without making it illegible, you can see the exact same trend. Whether you are in a strongly religious country or a very open country, you were getting the exact same trends. And you may say, well, you know, people who are at the receiving end of some of those terms, they are located around the world, and be completely right. But I think what this study tried to show was that the uptick happened in 2013, 2014, when there was a real sort of boom in social media. And if any of you have looked into social media and how they work, the algorithms that are there are driven by these sort of diverse or these adverse incentives. What really tends to happen is when people decide to troll or post this kind of content, it drives a whole lot of attention, and obviously attention is what the media sellers and media buyers and advertisers are looking for. So you will have a far stronger prevalence of these ideas coming through. So when you pick up these trends, be mindful of what might be an underlying cause or contributing factor to drive this sort of narrative. Another example I'd like to use is if you had a data set that showed you that you had 13 different data sets, and every single one of them showed that they had the same average and the same standard deviation on the x-axis and the same average and the same standard deviation on the y-axis, you would be inclined to think that it was telling the exact same story. And for any of you who know this example, this is called the Datasaurus example, the underlying data sets look like this. Every single one of those diagrams in different colors is what was used to present those data sets. And consequently, if you are, even if I take the ones that sit in the middle with the horizontal slant down or slant up, there may be trends that are showing almost completely opposite tendencies, yet when we do simplistic statistics on them, if we want to tell a story, we can come out with the exact same results. So as the saying goes, data without insights is meaningless, and insights without actions is pointless. So this is just an example to bear in mind with when we receive a lot of data, do we appreciate what the story is that's being told? And then it comes to the consultation side or the engagement. And, this is not only us, sharing communication out with any of our stakeholders, but this is when we consult with them to get information coming in and where do we get our data sources. And, I think the risk trend I'd like to call out here is the fact that everybody's an expert. And we saw a lot of this during the lockdown. Everybody had an opinion of what should be going on. We've seen it with the conflict in Israel and in the Gaza. Everybody thinks they know what's going on, and you're very entitled to that opinion. But when you're in an organization, you have to be thinking about this and be mindful of there are LinkedIn experts out there that are more like the person on the right than they are the person on the left. The people are quite knowledgeable, people who might be quite informed about some of the things are not necessarily the ones that are most prevalent on LinkedIn. I use LinkedIn a hell of a lot, and I can guarantee you that many people that I hold in high esteem around their insights on some of these themes and risks are not the posters on LinkedIn, but there are those who are sort of underscore some of these threats or these risky trends that I'm seeing, who sort of will strongly underscore what is coming through in the risks that we need to try and manage, and the trends that are potentially in what's the word I'm looking for, almost but inhabited with these challenges that we need to tackle. And again, as I mentioned earlier, AI. I previously in the one of the previous sessions I spoke about how I believe AI will play a far stronger role in the work we do in risk management, particularly on the governance side. It's very simple to go onto ChatGPT and say, please give me a 200-word risk policy, and you just do find and replace to put in a company name. It's very prevalent, but be aware that you can still find flaws. And the example is one that I found online where you would think it's going to give you the right answer and doesn't. And I can speak from personal opinion. I was roped into helping one of my daughters do her school maths, and it was dealing with things that were far too back in my history to remember them clearly. So I typed in what I thought was the answer into ChatGPT, and I asked them to explain it. And the explanation it gave me was more or less what I thought, but there was something, and I said, what about this? I think you might have got this wrong. And it apologized and corrected. And there's loads of those examples where people challenge AI, which they're obviously entitled to do. It is just a large language model. But there are also those who are taking this information as sacrosanct. There was a case where a lawyer had used ChatGPT looking for case law and got an answer that was completely fictitious. So bear in mind when you use these tools, how they can not necessarily be the areas you want to consult to get all your information. So what do we do about these risky trends? Now, obviously, there's a range of things that we can do, and I'm mindful that there's still a bit of time in the session. So I've only really picked on a couple things to bear in mind, just in case anyone wants to talk to anything. But what I'd like to say is it really comes down to thinking differently, as be the individual that has a different opinion to everyone else in the organization. You know, as risk practitioners, we are afforded the luxury, particularly some of us who sit fair and squarely within second line, we get to see so much of the organization. We get to see where there are tensions, where people are going off the rail. And quite often, we don't always have the luxury of calling out some of those things. But we should do that. When we have that role, I believe we should try and highlight where some of these concerns lie. So what are the kinds of things we can do? Well, first of all, I think it comes back to ourselves to begin with, is that, you know, if you think we know everything, you're never going to learn anything new. So, you know, be aware of the fact that there are differences out there that will surprise us if we look beyond the confines of what we've always worked to. And the three things that I'd sort of try and sort of underscore is look to get different opinions. Even if you have your standard go-tos to get information, look to alternatives, look to different sectors, whatever you can, try and look a bit more broader. Consider different scenarios, and I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. And then lastly, adopt different perspectives. You know, if you in a big enough team, you can ask people to play different roles, but if you as the individual are not necessarily getting those other sounding points, you need to adopt those different positions. So hopefully some of these things will make a bit more sense when I talk to them. So differences of opinion. This is a diagram that you can get, and it's called adsfontesmedia.com. And what it really does is it tries to show the level of bias across various news agencies and mainstream medias around the world. And just simply put, you have the left-wing view, the right-wing view, what is more reliable and what is less reliable. And, you know, many of us will probably read somewhere across that. And because that's quite a busy slide, let me use the more simplified version. And it shows, you know, if we use MSNBC as an idea of more left-leaning ideology and Fox News and Newsmax as more right-leaning, you'll be aware that there will be things that are dealt with in a very different way. I about 4 or 5 years ago, I purposely started trying to read media on different sides of the equation, and I was astounded by how an event could be viewed so differently by different media with their agendas. And I think it's easy to be in one camp and point fingers at the other camp and go, oh, you've got it so wrong, you are so naive, and you sort of in the minority. But we only need to look at the surprises that came out of the Brexit vote, the surprises that came out of the recent yes vote in Australia. We're inclined to believe that we're in the camp and we're in the right camp and we're the only camp. But there can sometimes be significantly more people in another camp. Some of them with quite obtuse views that we may not subscribe to, but there's also a lot of them that are probably closer to the middle of this diagram. And so it's worthwhile that not to just think in that dichotomy that I said earlier, but to realize, you know, you can talk to people on both sides and formulate a more informed opinion, partly just for yourself, but also because you're going to deal with these opinions across the business. And, you know, they're not always, people don't always wear their heart on their sleeve. They're very cautious not to say something that might be too outside of what is, you know, being spoken about or in the narrative. So be mindful of this when you are trying to gain some idea, some of an understanding of what is going on in the world. From a scenarios perspective, I'm really just almost talking about scenario analysis, and I know it's become quite prevalent in ESG, and that's the reason for me sort of carrying it on in this theme and in today's talk. But what I find quite ironic is the sort of some of the founding fathers of scenario analysis actually came out of the oil and gas industry, out of Shell. There was a guy by the name of Arie de Geus, who was at the time of the sort of oil crisis in the late 70s. He was needing to understand what are different ways this could play out. And for me, I was obviously too young to appreciate it, but where I started gaining some appreciation of the value of scenario analysis is, growing up in South Africa in the 80s and 90s, you were only too aware of where things could be heading. And there was a guy by the name of Clem Sunter who did some scenario analysis. He spoke about the high road and the low road. Now, obviously, you can make inferences about high and low and what that meant, but it was hugely valuable in informing some of the change that took place in the country, because people got to think about things that they wouldn't typically do. And so I'm just presenting a couple points here around how do you think around scenario analysis and things like there need to be multiple scenarios. Don't just go with two. Think about more scenarios. Try to start off with them being qualitative, because if we can't get quantitative data, which you should be able to, but if you can't, it will be very restricting in what you're willing to entertain. And sometimes a lot of those things that are meaningful are more qualitative in nature than just data-based. Try and push the limits, but keep them plausible. And obviously this is where we see it quite prevalent in some of the climate scenario analysis that we're doing. We're trying to get a sense of where it is slightly high and a little bit more high, just so that we get a sense of what are all these scenarios. And we may even have the luxury of trying to have one that is completely counterintuitive. But, we may not have enough of that data at the moment. And I know that the main narrative we're trying to tackle is how do we tackle carbon emissions? How do we, do what's better for the environment as a whole? So look at those scenarios, look at what's plausible, and sort of plot them almost on the periphery of what we know and the different directions we have. I think what's important is to be focused. And what I mean by that is when we are trying to analyze these scenarios, we need to think about context. When I showed you that the risk process, I'm a strong believer that many risk assessments go awry because we don't clearly understand the context and what we're trying to do. We need to probably be more narrow in our thinking than we should. So when we're doing the scenario analysis, ask a very specific question so that you can gain that information from those various scenarios. If it's too open-ended and it's looking at the entire system, it becomes quite complicated to really get our heads around what's going on there. We need to whittle it down. So it might sound like I'm being contradictory to, encouraging the pushing the limits, but this is saying I can have scenarios that are quite far removed, but I'm wanting to try and answer one question at a time, because then I have a better appreciation of what those sort of trade-offs might be. And also just be comfortable with them being open-ended. People are very keen to create a scenario and almost ring fence them, and they don't want to add too much to it, understandably so. But when there is a meaningful addition we can make to the model, let's see what happens. The work that was done on sort of chaos theory in sort of the 80s and 70s became mindful of how changing some of these variables just slightly ended up having, the butterfly effect, and it's worthwhile us entertaining some of those ideas, because what we want to ensure is that we're not using the scenario as a prediction of the future. We're using it to gain insights of where things could get pulled and how surprising that might be. And, we probably would need to work through an example in detail to show how, if we sort of tinker in one area, how it can drive the narrative in another direction. So I encourage you to look at things like scenario analysis or the Cynefin model or the OODA loop. Look for things that are not necessarily the standard linear way of thinking about the risks we need to manage. And then, as I said, getting different perspectives. I've thoroughly enjoyed working in teams where people have quite diverse opinions and diverse backgrounds. And obviously this is a reason, aside from treating past injustices, why diversity and inclusion is so important, because we get insights that we don't necessarily always have, and people might play these different roles. And what I've presented here is this Edward de Bono 6 hats model, and what you can do, even if you're an individual or you're working in a very small team, is to work through these different points of view and see what comes out. So I can work with the facts only, I can be more emotional, I can be more critical, and quite often, risk people are seen as the black hats in the organization. But I think we can be all of these other things. We can have a more positive view about things, we can have a more creative way of doing things, and we can have a bigger picture view. And that bigger picture view is probably partly what comes out when we look at scenario analysis. So what I've really tried to emphasize in some of these models is to consider these different things, because if we don't appreciate these biases and if we don't appreciate the risky trends, we do run the risk of not having the most accurate assessments and mitigating the risks in the right way. And that's where I'd like to leave it today. Any questions?
So far, we've got nothing listed, Ross.
Okay, well, I do encourage you to reach out to me. If my contact details on the slide deck, I will be sending it through shortly. I just wanted to make sure that it didn't overwhelm the Teams channel. So I'll mail it to Ian and Kerry right away.
Yep.
But please feel free to reach out if there's anything that people want to discuss.
We've got one question. Well, it's a two-parter. Where have you seen organisations do this well, and what is their differentiator?
I see the questions from Kerry. I think that the area where I've seen it done best, ironically, is within consultancies, and I guess that's only because there is a tendency not always to have sacred cows, and that we want to entertain things that are quite different. But when you might also have organizations where they have a sort of a skunk works, where they do things and they entertain these ideas. So when I spoke about that Clem Sunter example in South Africa, he was working for Anglo-American Mining House at the time. So you wouldn't think that a mining house would be that concerned about, what was going on, or wouldn't be the source of this knowledge. But these think tanks are where you see some of the discussion go. Another area which really struck me in reading both Steve Jobs' biography and Elon Musk is when you are in a safe environment, and what I mean safe is where people are not worried about their jobs, where people have enough money, where people have a whole lot of hubris, and they're genuinely trying to think about things. That's where you might see this conversation getting pulled wider and many aspects being entertained. I can really recommend either one of those biographies. I mean, Musk's obviously has only recently been released and it's quite interesting. So I would encourage looking at something like that. It's having these strong individuals, the people that we have front and center are of our sort of social media feeds are quite often people that are willing to push those agendas. Some are very conservative and will rein themselves in, but I found the Elon Musk's approach to doing things quite fascinating, particularly from looking at it through a risk lens.
Yep. Another question that's popped up is, could you direct us to the scenario models that you've referenced in this presentation today?
I will dig them up and I'll insert them in the mail that when I send the presentation to Kerry.
Awesome.
To share with you.
Awesome. So if we don't have any further questions, I'd like to take this time to thank Ross. Very informative from session 1, where we're looking at the risk register through to the real world. Then session 2, where we had better use of metrics and indicators in risk management, which was, for me personally, very thought-provoking, to now looking at the risk and risk trends. So I'd like to, on behalf of RIMS New Zealand and Pacific Islands, I'd like to thank Ross for these 3 very, very how can I put, thought-provoking and sometimes challenging sessions. And just remind you, everybody, that we on the 12th of February in Auckland at the Pullman Hotel, we have our risk conference. The links are in the chat here, but we will also attach it to the when we email out the presentation, and it's called Embracing the Risk. So I encourage everybody to jump onto the website. If you can't get it through the link here, then please jump onto our LinkedIn page and jump onto the early bird registration. It'll be worth coming, I guarantee it. So thanks very much, Ross.
Great, thank you, Ian, and thank you to
No
you and
worries.
Kerry for hosting me. Thanks, everybody.
Not a problem. Alrighty. Thanks, everybody.